Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church.
Hi, great welcome. He's Rob. I'm Rob. This is the Veritas Podcast. We are two men that really just want to be students of encyclicals and papal writings. And as we do our study, in particular with Libertas, we're trying to learn more about it. And we just thought that it'd be a good idea for other people to have opportunity to listen in. So that's really kind of the point of this podcast. We can be found at veritaspodcast@yahoo.com for email. We appreciate that. In our previous episode with Libertas Part 3, we're discussing the natural law, which is ingrained in all of us, and the eternal law, which comes from God. And there's a huge mess with all this when we don't follow this. But God's answer to this, and the Church's answer to this, and Pope Leo talks about this, is God's grace. We need to cooperate with it. And when we do, our will, which follows the good, finds good, the true good. And our intellect tries to find and follow the real truth. But what happens when we don't cooperate with God's grace is that our will follows what it perceives as good when in fact it's not. We talked about impurity and drugs, and the intellect can even be confused itself. And if that happens, then the will can kind of take over and lead us down a bad road. But what happens, and we talked about this, and Pope Leo did as well, is that society forms laws based on people's intellect. And these are generally good because these laws are kind of like road signs and traffic laws. They can help us go down the right path. And these are generally good. But because man is flawed, sometimes man's intellect is wrong, like I just mentioned before. It doesn't have the right truth. And so sometimes man and collectively society can create bad laws which as Catholics and human beings with right reason we shouldn't follow. And so that's where we'd like to pick up in this episode. All right, Pope Leo in Libertas writes, quote, "If then by anyone in authority something be sanctioned out of conformity with the principles of right reason and consequently hurtful to the commonwealth, such an enactment can have no binding force of law, as being no rule of justice, but certain to lead men away from that good which is the very end of civil society." End of quote.
Right. Yeah, that's getting to the heart of the question you brought up. A bad law is, in reality, it's no law at all. And therefore, man has no moral obligation to follow a bad law. What's a bad law? It's what he just said. It's a law that's not in conformity with right reason. And what's right reason? Right reason is reason conformed to the law of God. So when you have a law that forbids something that God commands, or if you have a law that commands something that God forbids, that's an unjust law. It's not obligatory. In fact, you cannot follow that law. Now, because law, what is law? Law is the ordination of reason. It's intended to order the reason to the good by informing it with the truth. But a bad law, a law that orders the reason away from the good and the true, which again, the true is the object of the intellect, the good is the object of the will. When a bad law, orders the intellect and the will away from their proper end, it's no law at all. Now, that doesn't mean that an evil leader, for example, Nero or someone, won't punish somebody for refusing to obey an evil law that he sanctions or that he enacts. It just means that law doesn't bind in conscience. And indeed, a Catholic, no one can follow a bad law. So the martyrs of old, they would not offer incense to the idols because offering incense to the idols is contrary to the first commandment. Now, their leader may have had a law in place that you must offer incense to the idols. If you don't, you'll be killed. That's an unjust law. It didn't bind in conscience. They didn't offer incense to the idols. They obeyed God rather than man. Now, man might punish them. He might kill them for doing that, but that just means they're a martyr. But so yeah, a bad law is no law at all. It does not bind in conscience at all. And unfortunately, when you live in a pagan society, and again, unfortunately, America is rapidly becoming a pagan society. When you live in a pagan society, you're going to have some bad laws. And that's why Leo the 13th, which he'll discuss later, he says that separation of church and state is a deadly error, since it eventually leads to a pagan society. Because what did Christ say? Christ said, you're either for me or you're against me. Okay? Now that teaching, that applies not only to an individual, it also applies to the state. So when a state is not for Christ, when it's not a Christian state, a Catholic state, when it's not for Christ, what's going to happen? It's going to be against Christ. It's going to be against Christ, and then what's it going to do? Eventually it's going to persecute the members of Christ's mystical body. And what's happening today? We're rapidly seeing an anti-Christian, an anti-Christ tyranny descending upon the members of the mystical body of Christ by trying to force us to obey bad laws. So unfortunately, we're in the situation today where we do have bad laws, but these bad laws don't bind in conscience, and no Catholic can obey a bad law. So that's an important point to bring up, especially in our day.
Yeah, Leo continues in paragraph 13 on this point, quote, moreover, the highest duty is to respect authority and obediently to submit to just law, and by this the members of a community are effectually protected from the wrongdoing of evil men, end of quote. Now, Rob, what does Pope Leo mean here?
Okay. In the Summa of St. Thomas quotes St. Isidore as saying this. This is what St. Isidore said. Laws were made that in fear thereof human audacity might be checked, that innocence might be safeguarded in the midst of wickedness, and that the dread of punishment might prevent the wicked from doing harm. So I think what Leo the 13th is getting at, he's saying that when members, because he got over the context of the encyclical is against the errors of liberalism. When members of society respect authority, okay, and when they submit to just laws, it protects the innocent people from the evil people, from the bad people. Whereas in a liberal society where everyone does what they want to do, what happens? Well, if everyone just does what they want to do with no moral laws, that the bad people run wild and do what they want to do, and that eventually will corrupt, or at least to a degree corrupt, or potentially harm the good or the innocent. So I think the point he's making is that it's good to have members of the community respect authority and obey just laws, as opposed to not respecting authority and allowing everyone to do as they please. So basically he's contrasting here an ordered society, okay, an ordered society, a society that has good moral laws that it enacts to help direct man in its choice, as opposed to a society where everyone basically does what they want without laws forbidding immoral acts. So you see, if you look at it in context, it's pretty clear what he's saying. He's addressing the errors of liberalism. What's the errors of liberalism? They have a false notion of human liberty. What's their false notion of human liberty? It's that I should be able to do whatever I want to do as long as I don't do physical harm to another person, but there's still moral harm. So I think that's what he's getting at there.
And we talked about that in a previous episode. Really, if you're arguing with a liberal on this point, you could say, why can't they hurt somebody else? They don't really have any true grounds to explain that. If they say this wrong thing is allowed, then why isn't this? After a while, it just kind of falls apart with no good foundation. So,
yeah,
and that's what
everything becomes subjective. So
right, that's a perfect word.
There's no objective rule or measure. Everything is subjective, and subjectively, nobody wants to get harmed, right? No one wants to be physically harmed. So I guess everyone's going to agree on that. So when it's subjective and no one wants to be harmed, that's the one law they're going to agree on, because it's subjective and no one wants to be harmed physically.
Yeah. Okay, Pope Leo then continues to explain that we must obey just authority because, quote, lawful power is from God, end of quote. But some people resist that authority, and this is contrary to reason. Now, Rob, can you help flesh out the difference between lawful and unlawful authority?
Yeah. All authority comes from God, like the Bible says. Authority is, you could look at authority as like a moral force that compels another person to obey. Okay, that moral force, it comes from God. Now, in order to flesh out what he's saying here, we need to make a distinction between the person in the position of authority, that's one thing, and a particular command, that's another thing, okay? Now, regarding the person that's doing the commanding, okay, he can either be in a position, in a authoritative position lawfully or unlawfully. If he's not there lawfully, then his commands, even if they're good commands, they do not possess any authority, and therefore they don't bind. So take, for example, maybe not the best example, but it'll make the point. Pope Michael. There's a person in Kansas that calls himself Pope Michael. He was elected Pope by his mother and I think 5 or 6 other people. And he lives in Kansas with his mother, and he claims to be the Pope. Okay? Now, he's not the Pope, but he claims to be the Pope. Now, if, quote-unquote, Pope Michael, if he gives a command to all Catholics, I command you to make the first 5 Saturdays. That's a darn good command. That's a good command. But it doesn't carry any authority because Pope Michael he's not validly elected Pope. So he has no authority to tell us what to do. So anything he says to do, it doesn't bind at all because he doesn't have the authority to command us, tell us to do anything. But now we also have the example, say we're dealing with a person who is in a lawful position of authority. So say Pope Francis. Pope Francis, he's the lawfully elected Pope, and say that he commands Catholics to commit a sin. Okay? Now, the Catholic would be bound in conscience to refuse the sin, to refuse the act, because the act is contrary to God's law, you see. So we have the distinction between the person doing the commanding, Pope Michael, he can't command anything, he's not in position, and then the particular act that's commanded. So you have Pope Francis, he is in a position of authority. He does have the right to command certain things, but his particular commands may not be just. He can't command somebody to divorce his wife that he was vows married to and marry somebody else, because that's contrary to God's law. So in that case, the particular command of the truly lawful authority would have no binding force. Another point we should mention here regarding obedience is that obedience is a moral virtue, okay? A moral virtue is it's a balance point between excess and defect. It's a balance point between 2 extremes. All moral virtues are a balance point between 2 extremes. Obedience is also a moral virtue. So excess, the way you violate obedience in excess is by obeying a command that you should not obey. So doing something sinful that someone in authority tells you to do. The way you violate obedience in defect is by not obeying something that you should obey. So it's important to realize that obedience is a moral virtue. So we're required to obey lawful superiors. We're required to obey Pope Francis or even Obama. We're required to obey Obama. But if one of those two gives us a command that's contrary to God's law, that's a sin, we cannot obey that command, even though it came from someone in a position of authority. In this case, Acts 5:29 applies. We must obey God rather than man. So did that kind of flesh it out and answer what you were asking?
Yes, very well, very thorough. It was really good. Let's skip ahead to paragraph 15. This is a really important one. It needs to be taken very slowly, methodically, so I'd like to try and do that. But before we do so, Rob, can you explain, and these are important concepts going forward, the concept of naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism?
Yes, these are important to grasp. These are the fundamental errors of our day. Naturalism, Father Fahey, he calls naturalism anti-supernaturalism. And that's interesting. He calls naturalism anti-supernatural, and that's what it is. Naturalism, there's a book written in the 1920s called Liberalism and Catholicism. In that book, the author, he defines naturalism as the system that seeks systematically to eliminate God and his supreme sovereignty over the natural order, over man. Okay, so it's the system that seeks to basically eliminate God from the picture. God's out of the picture. We're here by ourselves. God doesn't come into play. Now, naturalism, if you really get to the heart of it, it is the negation of the supernatural order in one of two ways. Either way will apply. Either they will claim God doesn't exist. Okay, that's basically atheism. Or they might go ahead and acknowledge, yeah, there must be a God up there, but he's just a God up there. He doesn't interfere in the natural order. Okay, so there's a God up there. He doesn't interfere in the natural order, and there's a lot of consequences to that teaching. One, if he doesn't interfere in the natural order, Jesus wasn't God. Jesus wasn't divine because Jesus was in the natural order. That's one consequence. If he doesn't interfere in the natural order, there's no divine revelation, because divine revelation is revelation from the supernatural order to the natural order. Okay, you see? Not only that, if he doesn't interfere in the natural order, there's also no grace. There's no sanctifying grace. What is sanctifying grace? Sanctifying grace is a participation in the life of God. It's basically God's supernatural life that he infuses into the soul. So the Bible talks about in John 3 being born again. Well, that's what that's referring to. We're born from our parent, from our mother, with a natural life, just a natural life. When we're born again through baptism, we receive the supernatural life of God infused into our soul, which makes us, as we read, I think it's in 1 Peter, we are a, quote, partaker of the divine nature. So if naturalism is right, there is no sanctifying grace within man. There's no revelation for his reason to adhere to, okay? And there's no grace that elevates his soul to the supernatural level. So that's naturalism. Now, what's rationalism? Rationalism is the application of the error of naturalism to human reason. Okay? So rationalism is naturalism as it applies to human reason. Now, what does that mean? Well, what do we say? What does naturalism believe? It believes that if there's a God, we'll assume that it's the version that says there is a God. If there's a God, he doesn't interfere in any way with the natural order. So that means there's no divine revelation, right? So that means then rationalism rejects divine revelation, okay? So it doesn't accept any divine revelation, and then what does that do? That makes human reason the sole principle of truth and the sole judge of right and wrong. See, there's no more revelation for man. There's only human reason. And then you have other consequences on this. You have, for example, the rationalist biblical scholars that we hear about today that started off in Protestantism and unfortunately worked its way into Catholicism, and at least the early part of the 20th century was condemned by Pius X. And it was condemned also by Leo XIII in Provedissimus Deus. But naturalism it rejects, remember, it rejects supernatural, any supernatural intervention in the natural order. So what does that mean? There's no miracles. It means there's no miracles. So what do the rationalistic, so-called biblical scholars do? They reject the miracles, and then what do? They try to explain them away. Okay, so they'll say the parting of the Red Sea. Well, see, that wasn't really the parting of a Red Sea. That was just, it was low tide, and there's a sandbar between point A and point B, and the water went down at low tide. The Israelites walked across, and then when the soldiers came, the Egyptians, the water rose up and they all drowned. See, they try to explain these things away with naturalistic, rationalistic explanations. Also, the feeding of the 5,000. They say that, Jesus multiplied the bread and the fishes and fed 5,000. What do they say? They say, no, actually what happened is, they actually had food stashed away, and they were kind of hiding it from each other. And then they became really charitable, and so they started sharing with each other. And so the feeding of 5,000, really, people were just sharing with each other. That's all it really was. So they go to these extreme, absurd measures to explain away anything supernatural in the Bible, any miracles. And Thomas Jefferson, you hear Thomas Jefferson spoken of as a great man of God. He was a naturalist. He was a deist. And so what did Thomas Jefferson do? He had his own version of the Bible, which they still sell. It's called the Jefferson Bible. And he cut out all the supernatural, because he didn't believe in the supernatural. So all you're left with is these moral teachings of humanitarian moral teachings of Jesus, with none of that superstitious, he would say superstitious miracles. So that's what rationalism will then do with the miracles in the Bible. So human reason becomes the sole judge of everything. All supernatural is rejected. Okay, so that's how you see naturalism applied to the human reason. It's all right now, and Rob is the sole principle of truth. Okay,
Rob, and you're making an excellent point. But what happens is these modernists, these naturalists, they have this smarter than thou complex that they think that science is God, that sort of thing, and so they think that people like you and I who have faith in Jesus and God, that we're being really naive and that kind of thing. But what happens is these canons, these beliefs of theirs, they are first. Then they go and look at, say, the Bible. So they say to themselves, no way can Jesus perform miracles. Then they read that he does feed 5,000. So because they cannot possibly believe it, they have to figure out a way to explain it away. It's exact opposite from what they say. They think that, people like you and I will fall for them being scientific and where's the explanation, when in fact, really, they already come to it with their mind made up, because it can't possibly be that supernatural things exist.
Exactly, because it's based on naturalism, because they come to it with a naturalistic worldview and a rationalistic worldview, and then they have to try to twist everything to bring it in line with what they already believe.
How does this all apply to liberalism?
Yeah. Okay, so we saw that rationalism is the application of naturalism to human reason. Well, liberalism is the application of naturalism to the human will. Okay? So naturalism rejects any divine revelation, any intervention of God in the natural order. So then what does liberalism say? We don't have to obey God. We don't have to obey God's law because we don't think it is God's law. We reject that very premise that there is a revealed law. We don't have to obey it. We get to do what we want to do. So now, see, we're getting to the heart of liberalism. We get to do what we want to do. Everything is based on our reason alone. The problem is the reason and the will, they affect each other. So someone, for example, who is involved in vice, they're attached to vice, they can't break free of their vice, eventually what's going to happen? Something's got to give. And what's probably going to give is their reason. See, so if they can't conform their will to their right reason because their vice is got too strong of a grip, so what do? They conform their reason to their vice. And how do they do that? By justifying it, by saying, well, it's not really bad. So you see, the reason then becomes so perverted that it becomes conformed to the vices, to the blind desires. So the will then, or the reason then, which is supposed to be what directs the will, it, in a sense, blindly follows the blind will. Remember, the will is a blind faculty? Well, when the reason conforms itself to the blind desires, what do you have? You have the blind following the blind. You have the reason, which has blinded itself, following the blind desires. And then that, of course, leads to complete chaos. And that also will lead to the point where people no longer have the truth. Like we talked about last episode, how people, they don't have the truth. And when someone does have the truth, they're almost offended. It's like, you think you have the truth? Yeah. They can't comprehend it because they don't have the truth. Their reason has been so perverted by conforming itself to their unthinking desires and justifying why. See, the reason can then justify why it's okay to do these things that the natural law really knows better. See, the natural law, you can sear the conscience like the Bible says, but it's still going to be there. And like I said in the first or second episode, I think that's got a lot to do with some of these psychological issues, because people they pervert their reason. Their reason then becomes conformed to their unthinking desires, and it justifies itself in different ways. But that natural law is still there, and they still have the conscience. You know, I've heard someone say one time, she was saying how she could never be quiet. She always had to have the radio going. She was saying how it was kind of a torment for her just to be still and be quiet. And that's because when you're still and when you're quiet, your conscience becomes a little bit louder. And when you embrace the era of naturalism and then rationalism and then liberalism, you're really in a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good point to stop here with what Leo calls the new order of the world, the naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism you've been focusing on so much. This is the Veritas podcast. Join us next time. We'll delve more into Libertas number 15. Pope Leo talks about this rationalism issue and really kind of shows the consequences of liberalism. So I look forward to it. Brother, I appreciate it.